Good afternoon. I'm Joan Brzezinski, and I'm at the China Center at the University of Minnesota. I would like to welcome you to the annual Bob and Kim Griffin Building U.S.-China Bridges Lecture. We're happy to welcome Dr. Deborah Brautigam as this year's featured speaker, but let's start this evening with welcoming remarks from Associate Vice President and Dean Meredith McQuaid.
Good afternoon, good evening, I guess, almost. Allow me to join in Joan's welcome to the return of the Griffin Lecture, live and in person, on campus during the fall semester with students, faculty, and staff reminding us every day why the University of Minnesota matters to the local and global community. Thank you for coming. I know, like me, you're looking forward to hearing our speaker this afternoon. The Bob and Kim Griffin Building U.S.-China Bridges Lecture is, as the name describes, the outcome of a generous gift from the Griffins, made almost 20 years ago now, when the world was really a very different place, when the U.S. and China were more friends than enemies, more collaborative than competitive, more open to sharing ideas than sowing skepticism. It began in a time when building a bridge between our two countries was based on the trust that each could and would build a structure together, one that started on each continent and met in the middle, a bridge that would facilitate friendship and understanding. This lecture series has been a concrete outcome of that gift, an opportunity for us to gather annually to share our interest in learning more, not only about China, but about the relationship between these two great superpowers. And over the past 18 years, we have learned about currency devaluation, about China's relationship with India and the Middle East, about the new Silk Road, migration and urban transformation in China, understanding and misunderstanding between us, China's influence, its opportunity and its challenges, China's younger generations and their ambitions, their beliefs, and their potential. In the past 5 years, each of the lectures has been about tensions, about predictions for the future, guarded advice on what hook we might hang our hope for a better future in a period of tumultuous change all over the world. This gift from Bob and Kim Griffin has continued to give and to inspire every year for the past 18 and will continue well into the future. Many others who are here this evening have been generous as well, giving financial and moral support, as the China Center, our Chinese students and scholars, our Chinese and Chinese American faculty and staff, and our Chinese partners hang on tightly to our traditions and our past successes as we weather what may be a long and challenging period. Gifts like the one that Bob and Kim Griffin made almost 20 years ago make a difference. Your support of all of the work that we do makes a difference. Your appreciation and understanding of the weight we feel as we attend to the mission of the China Center and the mission of this university, which was founded on the belief that all people are enriched by understanding, dedicated to the advancement of learning and the search for truth, and to the application of this knowledge to benefit the people of the state, the nation, and the world. Your appreciation for and understanding of the challenges inherent in this mission gives us the motivation to continue. Thank you again for being here and for your continued support.
Thank you, Meredith. I too would like to echo her thanks to you for joining us here today for our first ever back from the pandemic in-person lecture. Your support of the China Center and this university's historic engagement with China builds the many connections that we need to examine the myriad of complexities with the U.S.-China relationship. And it is indeed a pleasure to explore these challenges and opportunities and hopes for our relationship with China with you. At the end of the At the end of the program, we will have a Q&A session Please use the note card and pen that you received at check-in. And when you write your card question down, pass your card to the right. So your right, not my right. And then we'll collect them and use them at the end of the program for this session. Right now, I'm delighted to invite Professor John Freeman of the Department of Political Science to introduce our speaker. Professor Freeman is a Paul W. Frenzel Professor of Liberal Arts at the University of Minnesota, a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and a McKnight Distinguished University Professor. He's earned a Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Political Science Association. Welcome, Professor Freeman.
I'm honored today to introduce Dr. Deborah Brautigam as our speaker. Dr. Bräutigam, as you can see from your brochure, is the Bernard L. Schwartz Professor of Political Economy at the School for Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University, and she is the director of the school's China-Africa Research Initiative. This is, without a doubt, one of the leading institutions in the United States for political science and development economics. Dr. Brautigam earned her bachelor's degree at Ohio Wesleyan University. She earned her master's and PhDs degrees at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. Prior to attending graduate school, she studied China and Chinese language with the Yale in China program. And she also studied Chinese at Taiwan Normal University in Taipei. And as you can see, before joining the faculty, she was at Johns Hopkins. She was also a leading faculty member at both American University and Columbia University. She's held numerous visiting research and teaching appointments around the world. 3 examples: the University of Bergen in Norway, Stellenbosch University in South Africa, and the University of Sierra Leone. The books that are cited in the brochure are indeed 2 books that are widely read that Deborah has written. The Dragon's Gift, The Real Story of China and Africa, was published by the Oxford University Press, which is one of the top 3 or 4 presses for political science and social sciences, and also Will Africa Feed China, which was published by the same press in 2015. She has published an enormous number of peer-reviewed articles and chapters in university press books on a remarkable range of topics, including democratization, bilateral and multilateral foreign aid, direct foreign investment, international development finance, and other topics. In looking over some of her work and rereading some of it, 2 things struck me about Dr. Brautigam. The first is her prescience. As Joan mentioned, we now talk about the Belt and Road Initiative. We talk about debt trap diplomacy, and many other topics pertaining to China's leadership in international development around the world. But Dr. Brautigam was in Africa 20 years ago studying these same topics. I'd like to say that again if I could. She was actually in Africa studying Chinese efforts to promote development in Africa. And she was in several countries seeing firsthand what was going on in China more than 20 years ago. This gives her historical perspective on these controversies that are raging today that most of our peers lack. The second thing I would say about the work and the large body of work or corpus that Dr. Brautigam has produced reflects her intellectual ambition. She is willing and able to address the big debates in this field. An example of a big debate is the question, can countries develop democratically and economically simultaneously? A famous statement by a Brazilian politician was, democracy is not dessert. You don't get democracy after you've developed economically. You can achieve democracy and economic development simultaneously. She's very much engaged in that debate about whether that's possible. She's also more than willing and able to engage the debate about China's alleged debt diplomacy and to address that debate and to take a stand in it and to seek to resolve it. Her work in this regard is grounded in a remarkable range of middle range and micro level analyses, sectoral analyses of multiple industrial sectors of the economy, of work between China and African governments on electrification, on transportation in the form of standard gauge railways, and highways, of mining and of farming, and in multiple countries. She writes about Angola, about Ethiopia, about Zambia, about all these experiences these countries and governments have had with Chinese investors and aid. This gives her a range of argument and a depth of argument that is truly exceptional compared to that of her peers. She's currently at work on, the evidence of the high regard with which Dr. Braudigam's work is held by scholarly and policy communities is easy to find. She's received not one but 2 Fulbright Awards. She's received fellowships from the Council of Foreign Relations and the Woodrow Wilson International Center. She's won research grants from a number of institutions in our countries and abroad. Examples of such grants are gifts or support from the Carnegie Corporation and the United Kingdom Center for Economic Policy and Research. And again, as the brochure notes, she's been a consultant to the World Bank, the African Development Bank, the U.S. Agency for International Development, and other leading institutions in Germany, Norway, and other countries. And she has given testimony in the Congress, for example, to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And last but by no means least, she's a very visible person on international and national media. She's frequently interviewed by the New York Times, CNN, NPR, and even Al Jazeera. Dr. Brautigam currently is working on a book on China and global economic governance as seen through the case of sovereign debt restructuring. She literally just got back from Europe in the last week or 10 days. She talked there to individuals who've been involved in debt restructuring under the auspices of the Paris Club and other organizations, so she'll have some fresh insights for us about what's afoot in terms of trying to help these African countries deal with their debt and the restructuring thereof. Her topic for tonight is China, the United States, and global debt, why cooperate? And I ask you to please give her a warm welcome to the University of Minnesota.
Wow, thank you, everyone, and thank you, John, for that kind introduction. That was wonderful. And thank you to Joan, the members of the China Center, the university community, for inviting me here today. The China Center at the University of Minnesota, with its emphasis on building bridges instead of walls and on balance instead of bombast, is playing an important role in our community, so congratulations on that work. And on a personal note, I'm delighted to be back in Minneapolis, where my grandmother was born and where I hear all the women are strong. So it makes me feel like I'm coming home. So I have been doing research on China and the developing world for a long time, I mean, even longer than John said. And at this point, I'll show you just how long. So that picture there is of me doing research in Liberia, and I was looking at Chinese lending there, and that was in 1983. So that's really quite a few years ago. And the other picture that you can see I took, or it was taken just a couple of weeks ago, actually about 10 days ago in Montenegro. And there I am down there. I look a bit like an ant compared to in the other picture. But I think what these show is that this is China as it was a long time ago, engaged in the developing world, out there doing projects, and as it is today in the Belt and Road Initiative. So this is, the Montenegro picture is a dramatic example, I think, of the mingled hopes and worries about China's overseas lending in a context of rising debt. Now, I went to Montenegro to speak with Montenegrin and Chinese stakeholders about the project, and this followed up on extensive desk research that we had done at my research institute, and a briefing paper by 3 European colleagues who were specialists on this. And they unpacked what turned out to be erroneous reports, and these were reports that were circulated widely in the Financial Times, National Public Radio, et cetera, that Montenegro had pledged its territory as collateral for the Chinese loan. And this wasn't the case, as you can read our paper on this. They also showed how Montenegrin politicians had deliberately used the China threat generated by these mistaken beliefs and the fears in their election campaigns. and international negotiations with the European Union. So this turned out to be quite useful for the Montenegrins, even though the Chinese were not very happy about it. This kind of evidence-based forensic investigation, these in-country interviews and careful case study development underpins all of the work that we do on China at the research initiative I direct. So, why cooperate? To paraphrase something that Professor Freeman here wrote with my former colleague Joshua Goldstein in Three-Way Street in 1990, the United States and China must learn to cooperate if the world's children are going to survive and prosper. Remember that line? It was a good one. Yet, relations between China and the United States have deteriorated sharply since the global financial crisis in 2008, and particularly during the last 6 years of the Trump and Biden administrations. There are many reasons for this, and blame is on both sides. But the result is that the US and China have stopped cooperating to address urgent global problems like climate change, interstate conflict, nuclear proliferation, global health, and poverty. And unfortunately, we can now add global debt to that list. In 2018, when the UK advocacy group Debt Justice produced the graph up here, government and private sector debt was already reaching alarming levels, and this was happening all around the world. And since the COVID-19 pandemic began, Argentina, Belize, Ecuador, Lebanon, Suriname, Zambia, and Sri Lanka have all declared bankruptcy. They've defaulted on their sovereign bonds, and they're actively seeking debt restructuring. And others are sure to follow. The World Bank has been warning that 58% of the world's poorest countries are already in debt distress or at high risk of it. So what is China's role in this rise of global debt? How are Chinese creditors navigating what seems to be becoming a systemic global debt crisis, and what should the US be doing? So during the last global debt crisis, which began in the late 1970s, US stakeholders were deeply involved in these issues in an effort to reduce and then finally to cancel much of the debt in developing countries. This time around, though, China is the largest bilateral creditor. But bondholders, many of them US residents like you and me, hold vastly more debt in the developing world than do Chinese banks. And there's no global forum for debt restructuring. There's no international bankruptcy court. And as I will show, the Paris Club, which is an informal institution set up to shape official bilateral debt restructuring, may no longer be fit for purpose. So solving the challenge of developing country debt is going to require China and the US, the two largest economies, to work together. And ultimately, I believe it's likely to require a new financial architecture. Yet the increased hostility between the US and China is making this already difficult construction far more contentious. The rest of my talk is going to elaborate on these points. So, global sovereign debt. What is it? Does everyone know? If I was teaching this now, I'd ask for hands to come up. Are you all quite sure what global sovereign debt is? So governments, rich and poor, borrow abroad. They take out loans or they issue bonds so that they can fund investments or consumption without having to raise taxes. The US government, for example, has $30 trillion in debt that we owe to other foreigners, mainly treasury bonds. And China alone has $1 trillion of this, so they hold our debt. China's external government debt, i.e. what the Chinese government owes to other foreign creditors, is around $415 billion. So there's a lot of this global debt going on. The creditors that supply this borrowed money globally can be roughly divided into three different groups. We've got bilateral creditors. These are government creditors. We've got multilateral creditors like the World Bank and the IMF, the African Development Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, and we've got commercial creditors, which are the bondholders, et cetera, or the bonds and banks and so on. And so as you can see in this graph, globally, bilateral official government creditors about 14%. China's within that group. And then commercial are 63%. So it's much, much larger. So in Africa, these figures are a little bit different. Bilaterals, including China, are 28%. Multilaterals, 32%. And then commercial is smaller because African countries can't borrow on the global commercial markets as much. And so of these, I mark out which ones are bonds. So bonds are a relatively new in the global economy. Well, they aren't that new, but they're new in terms of developing countries taking them out. And they're supplying a large proportion of this debt. So, as the debt justice map shows, it's not just poor countries that get into trouble. Between 2008 and 2012, after US subprime lenders and hedge funds sparked the world's worst financial crisis in almost 80 years, banks and governments in Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Greece, and Spain defaulted on their debt. And Greece alone received a bailout from the European Union and the IMF of about $330 billion. As one investment analyst wrote in 2012, the world financial system is fully connected now, meaning a problem for Greece or another smaller European country is a problem for all of us. But note, you're saying mainly Europe. What about the rest of the world? So while Europe and the IMF moved quickly to bail out these 5 European countries, that's not always the case. When I was a university student in the 1970s and 1980s, low and middle income countries were swamped by a wretchedly lengthy debt crisis. So as you can see here in this slide, which uses World Bank data on Africa, debt owed by low and middle income countries to high income country governments, that's the blue part there, that's the bilateral debt, ballooned in the 1980s. And this happened in large part, this big chunk that you can see going on here, because the US was experiencing high inflation during the 1970s. And to combat our inflation, the US Federal Reserve Chairman, Paul Volcker, raised the US federal funds interest rate to 22.36% between 1979 and 1981. So that's a huge increase. That's pretty expensive, a lot higher than what we have today. So this cured inflation in the United States. But these high interest rates were exported overseas, and the country's debt service charges became much, much higher, the cost of servicing that debt, as you can see in this slide. So the blue bands and the orange bands grew over the 1980s, mainly due to those interest rate increases and the value of that debt. So the notion that debt problems in other countries are a problem for all of us, something that we need to cooperate to solve, and was slow to dawn on the wealthy countries at this time. But as you can see, that big lump of blue and that big lump of orange eventually shrank. And so that happened through global cooperation. And how did that happen? So it happened through global debt governance, through institutions that were set up to do this. So as the European debt crisis shows, international cooperation can solve these problems. And this cooperation helps solve collective action problems. And one of the most intense collective action problems in these kinds of negotiations is the free rider problem. So all of these creditors are afraid that if they give debt relief, then the borrowers are just going to use that debt relief to repay the other creditors. So they want to make sure that they're not going to be, the other creditors are not going to be free riding on their debt relief. So you boost that cooperation by things like mutual transparency. Everybody is open about how much money that the countries owe them. And that overcomes information asymmetries. You also need to all really be in the same room and move at the same time, roughly, so that you can be sure that that's free riding is not going to happen. And this also takes trust and time and institution building and perhaps rules, even legislation, and a judicious mixture of incentives and pressures, carrots and sticks. So in global debt governance, this international cooperation has occurred through a mix of formal rules and informal institutions, or club governance. And most of this has happened in the West. So the basis of this, the foundation of it, is the Bretton Woods system. And this slide is from 1944, when the IMF and the World Bank were first set up, and I think it's mostly men that were there. They brought joint resources together to try to build a system that would stop crises like the Great Depression that happened in the 1930s. So the IMF and its sister organization, the World Bank, are part of the formal institutional financial architecture. They are based on treaties, they're constituted under international law. And as the IMF puts it in its website, on joining the IMF, each country pledges to cooperate with all other member countries in resolving international monetary problems. So we're all promising to do this. That sounds good, right? So the IMF has 184 country members, and governments are represented through their ministers of finance and their central bankers. They hold shares. Now, the distribution of these shares is a contentious US-China geopolitical issue that some of you in the room might be familiar with. We don't have time to address it here, though we could later. I'm sure John's quite familiar with it. But it's a complicating factor in global debt management, and we'll move on from that. So, next, we have the Paris Club. And the Paris Club, and as John mentioned, I just got back from Europe, and I was talking to people in the Paris Club there, and the French Treasury and the French Central Bank about the Paris Club and how they're engaging with China. And those were fascinating talks, but I have still to write that up. But so I'll draw on that a little bit here, but just to tell you what they are, the Paris Club is an informal group. It's a club of bilateral official creditors, so they're governments that meet together, and they grew out of efforts to resolve Argentina's debt crisis in 1956. Argentina's had many since and many before that, but that was the start. And from 1956, it was basically rich countries that got together to do this. They have 22 government members now, and you can see how they're distributed around the world in this map. And nearly all of them are high-income countries, except for Brazil and Russia. And these are the only exceptions. Russia came in for geopolitical reasons in the 1990s, and Brazil joined in 2016. So that's been very recent. So other than that, they don't have developing countries in the Paris Club. It's a cartel of creditors. And although the Paris Club remains an informal group without a basis in international law, it has become highly institutionalized. It works very closely with the IMF, with the World Bank. It meets regularly to consider requests from borrower countries. But the premier forum for international economic cooperation is the G20, the group of 20. And the G20 evolved out of the G7, the G8. It started out as meetings, informal meetings of ministers of finance and central bankers of the 6 largest economies of the world in the 1970s, when the oil price shocks happened and when this great inflation was happening, when the gold standard collapsed, and so on. So they met to try to see what they could do together. It evolved into the G7 when Canada joined, and then the G8 with the inclusion of Russia. It's now back to being the G7 because Russia was suspended due to its actions in Crimea and the rest of Ukraine. So there's the G7, G8, tiny group of countries doing this economic cooperation. And then the Asian financial crisis hits in 1997. And the G7 realizes they're not going to be able to cooperate to solve this crisis. They need to bring others in. And so we have the G20. The G20 brings in, as you can see, we've got Brazil, China, India, Indonesia, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, South Korea, Turkey. It's far more representative of the world, essentially. And their goals are to promote industrial and emerging market country dialogue and cooperation on international economic issues, and to strengthen the international financial architecture. So they're really an important part of solving this problem. But they're also informal. So like the Paris Club, they are a club. They have no treaties, no secretariat. They operate by consensus. But they have a lot more legitimacy, I think, just in the basis of this membership. They have they represent 3/4 of global exports, 60% of the global population, 80% of global income. And importantly, it includes China and the United States, so they're in there together. That's not the case for the Paris Club. It's not the case for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, which are 2 other important institutions that also do rulemaking for the international financial architecture. But one thing is still left out here. As we've seen, now 63% of global debt is held by the private sector, bondholders and commercial banks. And they really aren't represented in any of these institutions that we've been talking about here. So, how did debt relief work historically? We need a little history in order to understand what's happening today. So this developing country debt crisis that we were looking at earlier that started in the 70s was eventually solved through decisions made largely in wealthy countries. And we'll go back, we'll look again at this map of the debt and how it changed with regard to Africa, because I think it's the most interesting. So although countries in Africa were defaulting already in the late 1970s, The last debt crisis is generally said to have started when Mexico defaulted in August of 1982. So you can see where that is there, the Mexico default. And this is, again, the Africa debt. So African debt was sort of declining at that point. And then also with the interest rates rising in the United States, it starts to rise. So the US became very concerned about the consequences of this debt happening, these debt crises happening, and Mexico defaulting right on our doorstep. And so we started figuring out what to do. We tried the Baker Plan, and then finally we negotiated the Brady Plan. So the Brady Plan, but it took time, as you can see there. Mexico defaults in 1982. The Brady Plan happens in 1989, so that's 7 years to get that going. And the Brady Plan dealt with emerging market countries only, so there were 17 countries that benefited. But the poorer countries that were also having problems and that were in Africa, nothing was happening for them yet. They were still being expected to pay all of their debts. By 1988, which is around when the Brady Plan was started, the Paris Club accepted that they had been bringing in all these countries in, they were coming, lining up in Paris, asking for debt relief, and they accepted, okay, finally, from 1956 to 1988, they gave no essential debt relief. They would just lengthen the payment period that countries had to repay. But in 1988, they started to accept that some of these countries had an insolvency problem. They were essentially bankrupt. It wasn't just a liquidity problem where they needed a little more time to pay their debts. So they started doing these modest haircuts, it's called, or to reduce the value of debt. And then in 1996, this was expanded to the World Bank and the IMF. And so the World Bank, the IMF started also giving small reductions in the debt that was owed to them by the developing countries, the poorest countries. And these were only the poorest countries. So it was 38 of the poorest countries in the world got what's called, became part of the Highly Indebted Poor Countries Initiative, the HIPC. And then by 2005, in the Multilateral Debt Reduction Initiative, the MDRI, the World Bank and the IMF agreed that they would cancel these debts. So in the HIPC, gradually the debt was canceled. The World Bank and IMF debt was gradually canceled. And this is still going on to this day. So countries are still, haven't completed all of this, but it's 38 countries only, and it's only for the debt that happened up until the 1990s. Then it was cut off. Any new debt happening after that period doesn't get treated under HIPC or the MDRI. So to summarize this, the Paris Club is there as an informal institution. They deal with bilateral debt only, and they don't include China or very many developing countries as creditors. The Brady Plan was effective, but it only addressed emerging market countries, just 17 of them, and it just lasted for 5 years. And then you have the HIPC program and the MDRI program, which dealt with bilateral and multilateral debt. But it is not being applied to the current situation. So that was it was supposed to be a one-time, only once. So, and the United States played a hugely important role in all of this. As the chief shareholder of the World Bank and the IMF and the architect of the notorious Washington Consensus. And it worked. As you can see in this slide, the debt was reduced. And so that big mountain of debt came down, and then we can see gradually it's starting to come up again. However, it would be a revision of history to say that the United States government did all of this on its own, that our government was always a champion of debt cancellation and poverty reduction. It was actually civil society activists in Europe, the United States, and borrower countries who pushed hard for these policies in the 1990s through the Jubilee 2000 campaign. When I moved to Washington in 1994, I found that every October, when the World Bank and the IMF were having their annual meetings, there were as many as 100,000 protesters in the streets, and they were all barricaded, and people were chanting. You've heard maybe about the protests in Seattle, the battle in Seattle. It was like that. It was really lively. It was a lot going on. And these activist campaigners succeeded in pushing our government and other wealthy governments to foot the bill for debt relief in these 38 of the poorest countries. But it took nearly 20 years from when the debt crisis began until that happened. And despite this debt relief that was offered, it wasn't simple and it wasn't fast. So it was protracted. Countries were still negotiating deals under the Brady Plan. 5 years after it was launched, under the HIPC initiative, it took an average of 3.5 years for countries to get some kind of debt relief. So it isn't fast and it isn't easy. And it left many issues unresolved. In particular, and the IMF even concluded during a report that was done by Ann Kruger, who happens to be one of my colleagues at Johns Hopkins at SAIS, they said that the existing process of debt restructuring is prolonged, unpredictable, and ultimately damaging to creditors and borrowers. And something new needs to happen. So Ann Kruger led a team that proposed a new mechanism to do sovereign debt restructuring, where we kind of bring everyone together to do this and have a new financial architecture for that. But the US voted it down in the IMF. So it essentially was never accepted. And so the new millennium began, and the problem of how to coordinate all three of those groups, bilateral, multilateral, and commercial, was not resolved. Meanwhile, China comes into the picture, and Chinese official finance is growing. As we can see here, this slide comes from the data that we've put together at our institute, at our initiative at Johns Hopkins. It's now being run by Boston University, so they're running the data and managing the data. But these are Chinese loan commitments by lenders. So you can see in 2000, when the millennium started, it's hardly visible. There's Chinese loans going on, but there's very little happening. And then it gradually grows until we get to 2016, and that's almost $30 billion that year alone. And what I've done in this slide is break it down into a lot of different categories of creditors. So you've got the official, the blue there is the Exim Bank, which is what China regards as its official bilateral creditor. So that's in the official government group. And then all the others there are regarded by China as in the commercial category. And so there are a lot of different entities acting. It's not just China there. All right. So, and as you can see here, as we get to this point here, so 2018, which is about the time that we're talking about these debt crises starting to come up and people are talking about this more, in Africa, we've got these different bands. China's in red, so they're now a big part of the holders of debt. We've got other bilateral creditors in blue. They're also significant. But it's not just the European countries now. We've got Saudi Arabia and Turkey and India and all of these countries that are not members of the Paris Club. And then you've got the other multilaterals and the World Bank, which are the green and the what looks like black there. They're still significant. And then these growing bondholders, which are purple. And they're the largest chunk of this. And then the commercial banks in orange. So it's a new situation. It looks very different than the way it did in the 70s and 80s. And that's what China is entering into. And of that situation, by 2020, we see globally, official China holds 5% of global debt in developing countries. The bondholders hold 49%. So I know there's this impression out there that the Chinese lending is just like swamping the developing world, but it's actually not the case. It's really the bondholders and bonds that are the largest segment of what countries owe. And then in Africa, it's also bondholders. It's 27% of all the debt is held by bondholders, and China is 13%. And the World Bank has 17%. So there's multilateral, bilateral, and commercial as these three big chunks. And there's no place for all of them to work together to negotiate debt restructuring or debt relief. So where was China when all of this is going on, all this history that I've been talking about? They didn't just emerge in 2000 as a lender. So the Chinese government has also been dealing with borrowing countries not being able to pay. Now, we began researching how Chinese lenders manage debt distress in their borrowers in 2018. And we published a study on this debt relief with Chinese characteristics that laid out everything that we could find out about how Chinese lenders deal with debt distress in their borrowers. And so what we found is that China's first African loans were made in 1960. So, and that was in Guinea. So, and in 1964, Chinese lenders or Chinese leaders published 8 principles governing their foreign aid. And principle number 3 said that their loans, they would extend the time period for repayment when necessary. So that was their way of dealing with debt distress. If countries needed more time to pay, they could get more time to pay. So what we found was that in 1980, when Guinea was supposed to have repaid those loans, they had a 20-year term, they hadn't paid anything. So it was totally, they still owed every penny of the loans that had been made. And so the Chinese extended the time period. And then they did this again, and they did this again. They also tried other solutions to the debt problems when countries couldn't pay. So in Mali, for example, the Chinese offered a debt equity swap. And so a Chinese company paid off part of the debt and gained some shares in a sugar factory that the Chinese had built, and that became a joint venture. And in Tanzania, the same thing happened with the Friendship textile factory. There was a debt equity swap, and a Chinese company came in with some shares, and they started running the factory again, which they are still running today. I visited there a few years ago. But the Chinese were members of the IMF and the World Bank. They knew about this HIPC initiative, and they were sitting on the board when all of these things were being negotiated and launched, and they also knew that they were supposed to be participating in the HIPC initiative because it was expected that all these other creditors would also participate. And so learning from these experiences, they launched their own debt cancellation program in poor countries in the year 2000. And this program differed from the HIPC initiative that the World Bank and the IMF and the Paris Club had done. For one thing, the IMF and the World Bank and the Paris Club used a lot of conditionality. To get debt relief, countries had to jump through a lot of hoops. They had to implement structural adjustment reforms. They had to liberalize their economies. The Chinese didn't ask for anything like that. They just provided the debt relief. But it was only for one category of loans, these interest-free loans. And so that happened. It was about $3.4 billion over the last 20 years. As you can see, it happened in different chunks, and it happened on more of a diplomatic basis in these big announcements that would happen at the United Nations or would happen in what's called the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. But we also found that wasn't the only thing the Chinese had done. It wasn't just this loan cancellation program for the interest-free loans in Africa and elsewhere. They also had done a number of debt restructuring and debt relief in other parts of the world, and these are the ones that we found in Africa. So there were a number of different things going on. But what we found is that these were very ad hoc, a lot of different outcomes. So there wasn't anything standardized at all. And we concluded that basically they were muddling through without much central coordination. We would see a Chinese bank doing its own debt restructuring, and then a Chinese company would do its own negotiations, and they would give a different kind of result there. And despite the much mythologized case of the Chinese financed Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, which is the foundation of the idea of debt trap diplomacy, where the New York Times erroneously reported that China had seized this port, which was financed by a Chinese bank, when Sri Lanka defaulted on the loan, there was in fact no default and there was no seizure. We did not find any cases where Chinese banks or the government seized an asset in or outside the borrower country when a country failed to repay. And so that idea that the Chinese are deliberately luring other countries into borrowing so that the Chinese can then gain leverage when the countries can't pay, we didn't find any evidence for that. So therefore, in early 2020, we had a system where the 22 members of the Paris Club dealt with official bilateral debt restructuring, but they only made up a small fraction of the debt. By that time, the Paris Club in Africa, they held only 8% of all of the African debt. And China held about 17% of sub-Saharan Africa, that is. And the Paris Club used a one-size-fits-all approach. The Chinese used a tailored approach that was project by project. The Paris Club dealt with a whole portfolio of debt. The Chinese just did it loan by loan as a project got into trouble. And the multilaterals were expecting at this point in 2020 that they would not have to reduce any debt again, as they had done during HIPC and MDRI. So they were pretty much saying, we're not going to do that again. And then the pandemic hit. So when the pandemic hit, the G20 at the behest of the World Bank and the IMF, they moved quickly to address this. So this is really commendable. They pledged a debt service moratorium, and they did all of this over Zoom or Teams or whatever mechanism they were using. They had a debt service moratorium, i.e. that countries didn't have to pay any principal or they didn't have to pay any interest during the pandemic. And they did this for about 73 low-income countries. And it was only for their official debt, not for their multilateral debt and not for their commercial debt, because they were only the official lenders. The G20 is government, so they could only do it for that official. And this happened so quickly. It was already launched. The pandemic, I know at Hopkins, it seemed to hit for us on March 13th. That was the evening that things just shut down. And this was launched in April, so it was negotiated at lightning speed compared to these other initiatives that had taken years to negotiate. And all 20 members, including China, were on board with this multilateral initiative. So this is really promising. And I think it happened because the G20 has had China as a member for several decades now, and so they're used to working together. And so it's a good forum for that cooperation. But the G20 could only issue this moratorium on their own official debt, as I mentioned. So they said all official bilateral creditors will participate, i.e. everyone in the G20. Private creditors will be called upon to publicly to participate in the initiative on comparable terms, so the same terms. And multilateral development banks like the World Bank will be asked to participate as well. And so the intention was clearly that all three creditor groups would join this debt suspension. Now, no middle income countries were included. It was limited just to this period of the pandemic, and nothing was canceled. They just said, okay, you don't have to pay, but then you have to pay that amount later. So it was very modest kind of relief. And the implementation wasn't smooth. And from our research, we've been finding out some of what happened during the negotiations, and a lot of it was pretty contentious. For example, the Paris Club members in the G20, they all had these common understandings of things, like what was an official bilateral creditor? And what was a commercial creditor? But these definitions were not something that sort of held globally. For example, the IMF didn't use these kinds of definitions. And so Germany, for example, has a state-owned bank, which you might think would be an official creditor, but they kept it out of this debt service suspension initiative on the grounds that it was a commercial bank. And so China did the same thing with China Development Bank. They kept it out of this DSSI, on the same grounds. But when China did this, it faced considerable criticism from US officials who came out in public and criticized the Chinese for keeping China Development Bank out. David Malpass, for example, who was appointed by the Trump administration to the World Bank, a number of times in public pronouncements, he was very critical of the Chinese for keeping China Development Bank out. And so, on the other hand, if you note again, private creditors will be called upon publicly to participate. Well, the Chinese did that. So Chinese President Xi Jinping called on Chinese financial institutions to hold friendly consultations with African countries and work out arrangements for commercial loans. And so what happened was that it worked like that in Africa. So Angola, for example, which was one of the countries, received debt relief from China Exim Bank on DSSI terms, which is the official creditor. And then with Industrial and Commercial Bank and China Development Bank, they negotiated even better terms, as they told us when we talked to the Minister of Finance in Angola. So they got $3.9 billion worth of suspended payments. But none of the top leaders in the wealthier countries like ours pushed publicly for their commercial lenders to take place in the DSSI. So we didn't see that happening from Trump, and we haven't seen that happening from President Biden either. So how did this DSSI work, and how did China work within this? So as we can see in this slide here, which shows the debt service, so that's the interest and principal that these countries were supposed to pay, these DSSI eligible countries. So you can see in 2020, when the whole thing started, The bondholders were owed 16% in these countries, and the Chinese bilateral creditors were owed, this actually includes China Development Bank because it's the World Bank had put them in as bilateral official, it's 27%. So they were the largest chunk. And so that's, and it's good that they joined in. You can also see here how this is changing. By 2024, the bondholders are going to be the largest chunk there, and 33% as bonds come due, and the Chinese are going to go down to 25. But let's look just at what happened during the DSSI. So as Jubilee or Debt Justice, the advocacy group that's been working on debt relief now for 30 years or so, they did an analysis of what the different creditors had done during this G20-sponsored debt relief operation. And they showed that there was inadequate burden sharing. So in their analysis here, the private lenders based in the UK, which is what they were focusing on since they're UK-based, they had suspended 0 payments. Bondholders had suspended 0 payments. The World Bank had suspended 0 payments. So none of them participated. China had suspended 45% of what it was expected to participate with, and France 64%, and so on. So nobody had done 100% yet, but the data was still incomplete because this was published in October, and the DSSI extended to the end of December. So we're still waiting for the World Bank actually to release the new data. We're hoping they would do it in October so that I could present it to you here, but they haven't released it yet. But what is striking is that even though the Chinese had the largest share, as you can see, as I mentioned earlier, they had 27% of the debt service that was due to them. They provided 55% of the total DSSI debt relief, and they were responsible for 27% of the total debt service that was due. So in Beijing, they were feeling like this is a little bit unfair. You know, the commercial guys were supposed to come up to the board. The multilaterals, we were going to try to get them on board too. None of them joined. And here we've done 55% of all of the total debt service during the DSSI. And so this felt a little bit as though it was unfair from their perspective. And I think from the perspective of others looking at this, it's also a little bit unfair. So the second thing that happened during the pandemic is that the G20 formed what's called the Common Framework. And the Common Framework was an effort to bring the Paris Club and the G20 together to restructure debt. And so the Common Framework is an experiment. And so far, only 3 countries have signed up: Chad, Zambia, and Ethiopia. It doesn't include the middle-income countries. It's only for the poor countries, the same group of 73 countries that the DSSI initiative applied to back in 2020. But there are other countries that have defaulted and that owe Chinese debt and owe debt to others. So we're going to look briefly at 4 of these here. Common Framework countries, Chad and Zambia; not Common Framework countries, Ecuador and Sri Lanka. And we're going to look at the composition of debt in these countries. So the first one is Chad. So in Chad, we've got UK, the largest chunk there is green. And what that green chunk is a commodity trader called Glencore. And they have lent money to Chad, and they're going to get repaid in oil, and it's $1.3 billion and 43% of their debt. So in this common framework, all of these official creditors got together. China agreed to suspend, to work out a debt resolution for Chad. The World Bank was not part of it. Libya was also there as part of this. But Glencore held it up, and they still haven't provided any debt relief. And so the common framework did not become a common framework, including the commercial creditors that were necessary to really restore Chad to debt sustainability. So the next case is Zambia. This is still ongoing as well. The Chinese are 31%. The bond market is 24%. UK banks, the World Bank, about the same, 10%, 11%. And so far, the focus has pretty much been on the Chinese to come to the table to restructure their debt. We did research in Zambia this summer, and we've published a paper on this. There are 18 different commercial creditors from China. It's a very complicated situation, and it's not surprising that it's taken now a year and a half to try to work out what's going to happen in that situation. But it's complicated. If we look at Ecuador, Ecuador moved rather quickly, and they've had a restructuring of their debt. They're not in the common framework. And so their bonds, they restructured their bonds, which was 46%, and then the Chinese restructured their debt, which was about 14%. That all worked fairly efficiently, although the multilateral debt. And that took care of quite a large enough chunk for Ecuador to move forward. And then Sri Lanka, which has also been in the news quite a bit recently. Here you've got, and this is something that, again, the US officials from the Treasury Department and others they keep coming out and saying, China's got to come to the table, China's got to do something about Sri Lanka. And you see that they're not part of the common framework. The bond market is the biggest proportion at 38%. China's got 18%. The Asia Development Bank, which isn't planning to join debt relief, is 14%. And then you've got Japan and the World Bank. So it's all of these different actors, and there's no place for them all to come together to negotiate this. So the common framework involves, to make this work, because it is a G20 mechanism, it is under this club that's been set up to do economic coordination for the whole global economy, essentially. It has 3 challenges to make it work for debt relief. It's a learning process for the Chinese government, which has taken on the task of coordinating not just its official bilateral creditor, China Exim Bank, its policy banks, but also its commercial banks, which are larger and growing. And so while to many outside, China appears to be a unified entity, once you get inside, you see Chinese banks compete actively with each other. They don't want to share information. They're hard to corral together. The heads of banks and policy banks can sometimes outrank officials in the Ministry of Finance who are trying to corral them. So it's a complicated and challenging situation. And the second thing is that restructuring with debt write-downs or haircuts is not simply a technical process. It's deeply political. And remember, it took 32 years for the Paris Club to do any haircuts and to build the political will to do this. And this is going to be hard in China because China, as I mentioned earlier, they owe external creditors $415 billion. And so politically, for Chinese citizens, they're not going to be that happy to see their government writing down or canceling debts in other countries when they owe so much as well, and no one's talking about doing anything about their debt. And third, as I've been saying over and over, the common framework doesn't have mechanisms to ensure fair burden sharing among the official creditors and the bondholders and the commodity traders that in many cases hold the bulk of the debt in these distressed countries, as I was showing you in some of those cases. And as presently designed, even well-organized creditor committees of bondholders still have to wait for the official creditors to make their move in the common framework before they can make their own move, and they're not actually part of it, they're just staying outside. So and the borrowers have little leverage to compel the commercial creditors or other official creditors to come into these frameworks. It's not yet set up with the mechanisms that it needs to have to get all of these actors at the same table. And yet, from our government, what we're mainly hearing is that China is the one that's impeding this or holding this all up. And I think Tim Jones said it well at Debt Justice in a paper that they published in July 2022, just a few months ago. He said, Western leaders blame China for the debt crises in Africa, but this is a distraction. The truth is it's their own banks, asset managers, and oil traders are far more responsible, but the G7 are letting them off the hook. So now in conclusion, the title of this talk is China, the US, and Global Debt. Why cooperate? And I hope I've made it clear that cooperation is strongly needed. We have a growing debt crisis. But where to go from here? As the world was falling into the Great Depression, and fascism was rising around 1930. And these are things that happen when global debt problems spread. It creates political instability. It's a dangerous situation. The activist philosopher Antonio Gramsci famously said that in this crisis, the crisis the world was in then, it consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. And so that's the situation that we're in now. The old ways of dealing with debt and dealing with a lot of things are dying, and the new ones are struggling to be born. How can the US, how can China cooperate in helping that birth happen? So we have a crisis not only of debt, but a crisis of global governance. The US has once again begun to raise interest rates, just as we did under Paul Volcker. And they're nowhere near 22% yet, but they're going up. And the pain is being felt in developing countries as the cost of servicing their debt is starting to rise and capital is flowing out of those countries to the US away from the global south. So what needs to be done is we need to craft a new financial architecture that brings all of these different entities together. But we're only at the starting point. And it's unrealistic to expect China and the other emerging creditors, Turkey, India, and the others, to simply adopt the Paris Club's rules. And the Paris Club, which was designed in an era when Paris Club members held the bulk of debt, that big blue period that we looked at earlier, it doesn't solve the problem of how to bring in the commercial creditors, particularly the bondholders and the multilateral banks, which together hold 86% of the debt in the low and middle income countries. So who needs to do this? Who's going to do it? Well, realistically, the G20 is the place to do it. That's the room where it needs to happen. With its diversity of membership, it's an appropriate club to craft a new financial architecture for debt management. The common framework has the legitimacy to do this. It needs a lot, but I think it's a really good starting point. It's going to take time and patience and wisdom and extensive diplomatic negotiations. The Chinese preference is for crossing the river by feeling the stones, as you know. They prefer an experimental approach, an evolutionary process, and that means that the Chinese are going to approach this cautiously, but I think it's very encouraging that they've joined in, they're part of the common framework, and they are experimenting with this. But creating a framework that includes all of the creditor stakeholders is going to solve some of the problems, like the definition of what's an official creditor, what's a commercial creditor. And we know China, since it's moving from the plan to the market still, its creditors are in those mixed groups. You know, they have some characteristics of being state entities, and they have many characteristics of being commercial entities. So if you bring everyone in, you don't have to worry so much about are they commercial or are they not. So, but the US, I think, in my view, they're bludgeoning the Chinese unfairly in this global debt environment. The US has not been taking the steps to bring in the bondholders and the other non-Chinese creditors to the common table. And if they don't take those steps, the common framework will lose legitimacy, and we may lose the opportunity we have to do something about this. So for 4 years, the Trump administration repeatedly called China a predatory lender and accused the Chinese of practicing debt trap diplomacy, even though there wasn't any evidence for that. So with its greater emphasis on evidence, the Biden administration has refrained from this. But the Biden administration officials continue to downplay what the Chinese have actually done. You know, 55% of the debt service suspended during the DSSI. It's an accomplishment. They should be applauded for that. Instead, they continue to point to China as the primary problem in global debt and Chinese intransigence as holding up resolution of the crisis. So for their part, the Chinese continue to resist calls to make their overseas lending more transparent or to publish data on their loans, and all of this fosters suspicion, quite rightly. Although our research suggests that borrower countries in debt distress do open their books to the IMF, and no Chinese loans are deliberately hidden, which we've heard a lot about the hidden loans, confidentiality clauses in Chinese loans do keep countries from publishing the terms or contracts unless it's required by local laws in the borrower country. And Chinese diplomats are applauded at home for undiplomatic behavior as wolf warriors. And this is not only unprofessional, it's counterproductive for China and for solving these problems, which require diplomacy. Finally, it's not clear whether the US and China can summon the wise leadership, given their politics, given our politics, that will be required to cooperate on global debt when they were unable to cooperate during the COVID-19 pandemic, which was a pretty serious threat. And again, to paraphrase Professor Freeman and Goldstein, each country wants the other one to cooperate with it, rather than seeing what each country needs to do in order to get to yes. So let me end on a hopeful note, despite all that grim analysis. Periods of crisis do tend to produce more rapid institutional change, and we seem to be embarking on a global debt crisis once again. Addressing the problem of bankruptcy in developing countries in a way that's fair to all parties, protects the vulnerable, and is transparent is long overdue. With wisdom, patience, and sustained pressure from well-informed advocacy groups and students, like perhaps some in this room, the international community can cooperate and work toward greater justice in global debt management. It's possible, and it's long overdue. If we're going to work toward a world where, as Professor Freeman put it, all the world's children are going to survive and prosper. And that's the biggest reason why the US and China need to cooperate. Thank you.
Can I invite you to come and sit down?
Go through these questions as quickly as I can here, but let me ask the specific question and then perhaps elaborate a little bit. How would you characterize, if any, covenants, including the default clauses, demanded by the trustee and by the bondholder's ability to require repayments? And are these bonds ever secured with specific assets? And let me elaborate just a little bit on the assets. If the Chinese tie this to particular assets within a country, and the country is not able to meet the terms, then doesn't China open up the possibility of taking over assets within these countries? And isn't it, in fact, then reasonable for us to be worried about debt diplomacy leading to a trap in which assets are transferred to the Chinese?
That's a really good question, and I wish you could read our paper on the standard gauge railway in Kenya, in which we looked at these kinds of questions. These are, well, first of all, the Chinese contracts for loans don't have the project that's being funded. It is not collateral for the loan. So the loans have sovereign guarantees. So the government has guaranteed the loan. If the government goes bankrupt, they can't come and sort of grab the project because there's no contractual mechanism to do that. And so it's, in fact, we have not seen a single contract in which there is an asset being used as collateral. What's confusing about this is that sometimes there is, and this gets very technical, but sometimes there's an escrow account that payments, for example, in the standard gauge railway that we looked at in Kenya, the railway is partly being repaid through charges that are coming in from the Kenya Ports Authority. They were through it's a take or pay agreement. It gets into very complicated legal structures, but if the Port Authority didn't ship cargo on the railway, then they agreed to pay into an escrow account the equivalent that they would have shipped if they didn't ship a certain amount. And these are very kind of common project finance structures in international commercial project finance. So you do find some structures like that, but that doesn't mean, for example, in Kenya, the rumor arose that the Chinese could seize the Kenya port if they didn't repay the railway loan. And it's a misreading of these complex legal structures. take-or-pay agreements, which are common in project finance, and which, if you go to business school, you read about these all the time, or if you're involved as a lawyer in these international transactions, these are common structures. But it's very different from saying that it's collateral that can be seized in the event of a default.
In the way that someone could take your house if you don't make the payments or something akin to that.
It's very different from that.
But
yeah.
then, what is the misinterpretation and misunderstanding of the takeover of the Sri Lankan port? Because that is often cited by the media as that the Sri Lankans could not pay their debt, and that the Chinese got a 99-year lease on the I can't say it, port in Sri Lanka.
Hambantota port. That's something that I've written about with Meg Rithmeyer at Harvard Business School. We did an article in The Atlantic, so it has a lot more detail on this particular case, but I'll just give you a few key points to it. When this, the debt for that port was 2.5%. The debt service for that port was 2.5% of what Sri Lanka owed in the year that that was being negotiated. So 2.5% of the total debt service that they were supposed to make in that year is not very significant. What Sri Lanka faced in the year that that was being negotiated was very large bond payments that they needed to make. And bond payments need to be made in chunks. So the way a bond works is that you pay interest on it, or coupon, for like 10-year bond. You pay interest every year, and at the end of the 10 years, you have to pay the whole amount back. And so it's a big chunk. And so Sri Lanka had these bond payments due that year, and they really needed cash. A new government came in that was not very excited about that port either. And so they decided to privatize the port, essentially. So this is a very, making a long story very, very short. But so the loan never went into default. It was a small portion of what they owed for debt service. And the new government wanted to get rid of it because it was a pet project of the previous government, and it was going to take a while to become profitable. So that port was originally designed by a Canadian company who said that this is a really good project, and the Canadians really wanted to do that back in the late 1990s. So it wasn't even originally a Chinese project. They took it over from these Canadians.
So the idea that the Chinese plotted from the very beginning to engineer the takeover of this port as part of the maritime arm of the Belt and Road Initiative is really something that is untrue.
Yeah.
That's basically the same.
So there's a lot. Every time you dig into these, it's so interesting because when you find out the real story, it's much more complicated. But then it's also hard because, the New York Times headlines is so how China got Sri Lanka to cough up a port. It's such a good headline, and everybody remembers that. But my colleague Meg Rithmeyer at Harvard Business School says, it should have been how Sri Lanka got China to cough up a port, because they got $1.3 billion by leasing that port to the Chinese company that they could then use to repay those bonds. So it was a pretty good deal from their point. And now they've got essentially this free port.
A more general question that, again, I'll try to concretize a bit. How do you think technology affects our relationships with China? And will it help or hinder the process or hinder the kind of progress you're calling for? I think in terms of debt, one would assume that with the advent of the internet now, all these people in the G20 have this data at their fingertips. They can propose negotiations that can occur very rapidly via Zoom or whatever. Does technology and the advent of the internet really facilitate the kind of cooperation you're calling for? Or is it really more of an epiphenomenon that isn't really relevant?
Yeah, I would say two things about that. One is that technology is helping in terms of transparency. So the problem in these poor countries is that if you go to these ministries of finance and these debt management offices, you find that their levels of capacity and the staff they have are very low. They have to do all of this reporting. They have to record all of these different creditors and aid donors and everyone they have. It's quite extensive. And so they're not reporting their Chinese and other loans largely because they lack the capacity. So having this all be electrify, be able to transmit it electronically, fill in these forms electronically. All that's going to help in creating the information that's needed to reduce these information asymmetries. So that will help in the negotiations for transparency. But where it doesn't help is that negotiations really happen best face-to-face. And so it's better to be in the room rather than doing it on Zoom or remotely. So they were able to negotiate this whole common framework in the G20 during the pandemic was remarkable. But it's hard to build those personal connections, the guanxi that Chinese talk about, when you're doing it on Zoom and when you're doing it in different time zones as well. So I think in that sense, the fact that it created the conditions where the debt relief could happen, but it didn't create the relationships that need to happen in order for it to be sustained.
There's some really good questions about your own personal life course here about how you got interested in China. Maybe I could ask just one other question pertaining to the talk, and then we'll end with that question about your own personal interest in China. Let me summarize this briefly. What was the real motivation for China to lend billions to poor countries when Chinese knew that there was a very high likelihood of default and a very high likelihood that the money would not be paid back?
See, I don't believe they knew there was a high likelihood of default or that the money wouldn't be paid back. If you look at the global economy during the last 20 years, and particularly in Africa and other places, it was booming. You know, growth rates were really high. We talked about Africa becoming these frontier markets. So countries were not just emerging markets, they were frontier markets, and the bondholders were all going in there and pumping money into these countries as well. And so there was this irrational exuberance going on, and the Chinese were not immune to it. So they also thought that these countries would be repaying. And it was only in 2014, 2015, when it started to become clear that there were problems happening. And what we show in our data is that the Chinese, the money from China Exim Bank, from the official creditor, peaked in 2013 in Africa and then starts to decline as these conditions become more challenging. And then the commercial banks are a little slower to pick up on this. And so the 2016 is when it peaked for them, and then it's going down. So they were responding, but by then the loans that had been made earlier are now coming due. And so I don't think it was that I think they were hit just like the commercial banks in the 70s were hit in the last debt crisis. There is this idea that they'll pay.
I must interrupt and say I think this is all about managerial incentives and the separation of ownership and control, but I'll just leave it at that. Maybe at dinner we can talk about that.
Let me add one more thing to that, John, though, which is that these Chinese banks they're not going out just out of altruism at all. They're going out to pave the way for Chinese companies to get business. So in the construction market, for example, Chinese construction companies whose business is fostered by these loans from the Exim Bank, they make $50 billion a year in revenues in Africa. It's a third of their global market. So it's, and the banks, it's a synergism there with the banks and the companies working together to get that business. So it's good business for China to get those companies out and have them expand abroad.
Yeah, well, maybe we'll conclude with it. One of the folks wanted to know a little bit more about how, as an undergraduate, you came to the crossroads of one type or another and decided to become a China specialist, and a China specialist that focused on Africa.
Well, I didn't do it as an undergraduate. As an undergraduate, what I wanted to do was see the world. And so I worked in a restaurant to earn the money to buy a ticket to go and start a trip around the world. And I did that about 7 or 8 months after I graduated. I had enough money to do it. And I just started working and traveling, and it took me about 4 years. And during that time, I decided that I really needed an Asian language because I was focused on Asia. I, by that time, ended up in Thailand. And that was about 2 years after I started traveling. I taught English. And Thai wasn't that useful as a language if you wanted to study international relations. So I thought, should I study Japanese, Korean, or Chinese? And it was just kind of random. So I started studying Chinese in Hong Kong. I then went to Taiwan, and I fell in love with the language. And then in graduate school, I was really interested in development. and the big development problems were happening in Africa. So I thought, how can I bring my interest in China together with my interest in development? And I decided to study what the Chinese are doing in their foreign aid program, and that's what brought that all together. And I have to tell you, at the time, people say I was prescient to do my PhD dissertation on China and Africa, like I knew back in 1983 that this was going to become a really big topic someday. I had no idea. I was lucky. I followed what I loved, and that's what I love to do.
We're all glad that you did. So thank you very much, Professor Brautigam, and thanks everybody for coming and for these excellent questions too.
So on behalf of the China Center and the university, I'd like to thank everyone for coming again and hope that you enjoyed this talk. Please give us your feedback, and I hope we'll see you again next year. But we have a slight award to present to you.